Welcome to Decades of Heistery, where we cover safecrackers and bank heists from 1926 up until U.S. involvement in World War II. Picture a roaring 20s bank robber. Is it Jimmy Cagney saying, "Yeah, she, it's curtains for you, yeah, she"? Is it the fedora, the suit, that whole look? Maybe the souped up fronty Ford rumbling down a dirt road at breakneck speed, say 50 or 60 miles an hour. Maybe it's the pistols and the Tommy guns. Could include the malls or those loosely affiliated girlfriends. It might include the slang language like mall or cabbage and kale in reference to money. You may picture the crafty yag cracking safes in a dark and quiet bank vault. Or conversely, you might picture a brute robbery combine kicking in the door of a rural bank and yelling, "Hands up or you'll get it." Well, of course, there's a lot of truth in that image that we just described above. But in this video, we'll see that robbers and roaring 20s criminals didn't always fit that image. June 1927, for whatever reason, was way out of control. This Decades of Heistery will see a focus on women criminals, politically motivated robbers, and, perhaps less surprising, a politician turned yeg. Recall that yeg is a term specifically for safecracker, although we've seen it used to describe jewelry thieves and thieves in general as well. We'll also see that no one was immune to being touched by crime, even U.S. presidents. The June 30, 1927 Evening Star had an article titled, "Girl is Accused as Bandit Driver." Subtitled, "Relay of Autos Used in Bank Robbery, Officers Say, 3 Men Held." Well, at this point, if you've seen previous videos, you won't be shocked as we head back to Oklahoma, where we learn that a car chase took place through 3 states. They don't mention the states. It could be Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, Texas, most likely, a combination of 2 of those, and Oklahoma. Well, after the car chase, this led to 3 men being captured. They were being held for the $5,000 heist of a bank in Chickasha, Oklahoma. Among those arrested were Jack Long, allegedly the girl who's referenced in the title, it's her husband. Also Chester Fowler, who was picked up in McAlester, Oklahoma, and Red Whalen, who was picked up in Kansas City, Missouri. And lastly, police were able to trace Pearl Louise Lewis, who sounds like an innocent librarian and was all of 21 years of age, and the alleged getaway driver to Dallas, Texas, and then even further south down to Houston. She was arrested in Houston on June 29, 1927 at a rooming house from which Oklahoma officers led her to an awaiting car. On the way to the car, Pearl Louise Lewis defied officers. They said she tossed her pretty black head back and dared newspaper reporters to, quote, "write something about it. Just write something about it," end quote. While Pearl Louise waived extradition from Texas to Oklahoma and agreed to return to the scene of the crime. Now, indicative that we're dealing with a different time, the officers promised to stop in Dallas, Texas on the way. That was where Pearl Louise had left her 2.5-year-old baby with a friend. Of that $5,000, about $1,400 or so had been recovered as of June 30th. What is impressive tactically is that this crew set up a relay of automobiles along the escape route and used different makes and models to throw off witnesses and law enforcement. Now, that's our third lady covered in the field of bank robbery. You may or may not recall Rebecca Bradley Rogers in Texas and Marion Myers in South Dakota. The New Britain Daily Herald ran an entire page special report titled, "Teaching Girl Bandits That Crime Does Not Pay." The War and Peace-like subtitle was, "How the Law Has Put Safely Behind Prison Bars Most of the Young Women Criminals Who for Months Have Been Terrorizing Europe with Their Amazing Deeds." A few of the notorious female crooks in the enormous article were Raimonda Mazalares, quote, the beautiful Spanish girl who became the leader of a notorious band of Paris Apaches, end quote. Peggy Travers, quote, who led a band of English crooks and is now serving a long prison term, end quote. One they referred to as the angel-faced kid, quote, who was so much in demand as a dancing partner in fashionable drawing rooms, was known in the city's underworld as one of the most reckless and merciless outlaws of modern times. Marta Franca, quote, who posed as a member of fashionable society in Paris and Berlin while directing the activities of a group of men and women criminals, end quote, and a candidate for the 1927 Decades of History Nickname of the Year Award, Muriel the Peach, quote, now doing time in an English prison after a career of crime, end quote. They were responsible for auto thefts, store looting, robberies, mail robbery, holdups, confidence games, home burglaries, and even attempted murder. Now, an interesting point that was probably inadvertent was that what they were describing seems like a post-World War response, since many of these ladies committed crimes to fuel a partying lifestyle that we associate with the Roaring Twenties. Now we meet Chester A. Good, a state representative from Highland Park, Michigan. And with a name like that, he had to be, well, good. But at what? Good was arrested and charged with 4 branch bank holdups totaling nearly $30,000. And according to 2 alleged accomplices, it was Good who planned at least 2 of the heists and, of course, shared in the loot. Good, being a politician, denied the charge and suggested that he was being framed. If only he had Twitter X back then, he could have just said he was hacked. Well, the Montgomery Advertiser ran a June 29th editorial on Good and playfully made references to politicians and lawyers being crooks like we do today, and added, quote, what then more natural than that the plunderer should turn to safecracking, end quote. The Sunday Star brings us a story of international criminal intrigue titled, Paris Police Nab Chief of Pistoleros, Hunted for Years in Many Lands. Martinez Jimenez, also known as Valero Solamas, was once an engineering student who applied engineering-like thinking to his craft, quote, piercing burglar-proof safes, end quote. By 1927, he'd already had a long career that included assassinations and, quote, the dynamiting of the Spanish bank at Gijón, end quote, and also had connections spread across Europe. He was considered one of the, quote, international burgling anarchists, end quote. Thankfully, the author differentiated for us between revolutionaries and anarchists. The former, quote, pursued a political ideal, and the latter were more focused on money and terrorism. The bottom line was that foreign Roaring Twenties crime definitely included bank robbery. And speaking of revolution and anarchy, or fighting labor, we revisit Sacco and Vanzetti yet again. The Daily Worker's New York edition juxtaposed side-by-side stories. The first appearing negative in title, Doom Still Hangs Over Heads of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. Well, the gist of that story was that Massachusetts Governor Allen T. Fuller set up an advisory committee to look into the entire Sacco and Vanzetti saga. But there were issues with the committee, according to the Daily Worker. One major issue was that it would act in secret, and that 3 members were conservative, with a small c, New England types. Now, the other articles sounded so much more hopeful. Sacco, Vanzetti, reprieves soon is Boston belief. Well, they recounted that the July 10th scheduled electric chair appointment seemed likely to be heading towards a reprieve. Our connection to the Sacco and Vanzetti saga was bank robber Celestino Medeiros, who was set to face the electric chair himself, for the murder of bank teller James A. Carpenter during the November 1924 Wrentham National Bank heist. Now, we covered Medeiros and Wrentham National Bank back in our July 1926 episode, and then followed up in August, September, and October of 1926, and February and April of 1927, why I'm calling it a saga. It was Medeiros who confessed to being part of the gang that actually committed the now famous payroll murder heist at the Hutchins and Rice shoe factory. Though he didn't say it, Medeiros may have been involved with the Providence, Rhode Island Morelli gang in that crime. The South Bend News-Times brought us a story showing that anybody could have been on the other side of these criminals, titled Counterfeit Bills Found Near President's Camp. It seemed that the 1927 summer White House was located in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And apparently 2 of the people guarding the president found, quote, the torn ends of some paper currency along the roadside, end quote. Well, they took it to the First National Bank, where cashier Frank Holly, quote, took one look, threw up his hands in horror, and pronounced them to be exceedingly good counterfeit, end quote. It was not reported if President Coolidge was involved in any way. Now, was crime really rampant to the point that it was noticeable? Well, according to an editorial about a murderer in Georgia, the Cordell Dispatch noted that, quote, the British Empire has less murders than the city of Chicago in a year, end quote. They noted the same for New York and feared that Atlanta was heading that way too. The Bismarck Tribune discussed crime-related insurance rates in an editorial titled The Cost of Crime. They found that crime in general was not necessarily up across the United States, but in certain regions. Our 1926 Year in Review video produced lots of data that showed indeed bank robbery was a regional game. Recall that the number 1 bank heist state for 1926 was California. Texas was second. And then the area or region that had kind of the most cumulative bank robberies was in the upper Midwest over to the East Coast. Well, they gave an example. They referenced Cook County, Illinois, home to Chicago, and noted that it was way up in terms of holdups and therefore insurance rates. So what were the telltale signs of lower crime? Sufficient number of policemen on the streets, an absence of graft, effective cooperation between police agencies, interagency cooperation, and, quote, swift and sure conviction and punishment, end quote, which is basically the same old that we could hear in today's paper. The Sunday Star, New Britain Daily Herald, and Daily Alaska Empire all ran an AP article, and the Montgomery Advertiser ran an editorial. The takeaway from all of that being that 19 state legislatures had, quote, enacted notable anti-crime measures this year, end quote. Much of that work had been done very recently. Now, in the era of the educated expert, which this time period was, the Chicago Daily News noted the existence of crime commissions, and that 54 of them would participate in a conference in Washington, D.C. that autumn. It seemed that the use of a deadly weapon during the commission of crime became the focus by state legislators, setting up an ongoing debate about what we call gun control today. More of the same old, same old. That Jimmy Cagney image I brought up at the beginning is, of course, from the movies. Like today, movies attempt to reflect the culture. We see a comedy that dealt with the aftermath of the Great War, World War I. Lost at the Front follows 2 Western power soldiers who come upon the Russian Battalion of Death, which happened to be, quote, an army of pretty women, end quote. At one point, the main characters are even examined to see if they were suitable candidates for the battalion. Meanwhile, The Escape was a film about a, quote, plucky cowboy who single-handed prevented a bank robbery, end quote. Not surprisingly, after that, he managed to fight off the bandits and, quote, won the heart of a true daughter of the great West, end quote. Now, Birds of Prey sounds like a sad film, yet it brings us kind of full circle to the idea of women criminals and women bank robbers. A gang of bank robbers, including a woman, blackmail a bank president who had a criminal background. However, she was in love with the bank president's son, and so she spills the beans. Sadly, the gang and the bank president all die in the end. Spoiler alert. So much for Hollywood's happy endings. And so this is the idea of using relatively new technology to discuss the culture, conditions, and crime that were occurring at the time. Well, our final example comes to us from the Askoff American. A, quote, telephoto, end quote, was sent from Waco, Texas to New York. Police were able to use it to then arrest James Crowder, who'd been charged with embezzling $32,000 from the Liberty National Bank of Waco, Texas, where he'd been a cashier. Well, it's curtains for this video, see? But there are so many June 1927 follow-ups that there's actually going to be 2 separate episodes. Next up, a video exclusively on the capture and associated mayhem of Matt Killer Kimes. The following week's follow-up episode will update Wilbur Underhill, the pretend padre who was caught with nitroglycerin, the murdered Ferguson Farm prison guard named Raider, and much, much more. Violence is promised, and it will be delivered. For now, I want to thank you for spending your time with Decades of History. Till next time.